All right, well, welcome everyone to the American Cetacean Society San Francisco Bay Chapter's February 2024 speaker event. And I'm Susan Hopp, board member responsible for our speaker program. And with me is fellow board member Wade Cobb. So for anyone new to the American Cetacean Society, we are a chapter within a national organization that is the oldest nonprofit dedicated to the protection of whales, dolphins, porpoises, and their habitat. And we do this through education, community engagement, and awarding grants towards cetacean research. And we really appreciate your donations in support of our mission. They fund our research grants to scientists and expenses for these talks. And it's easy to donate on our website if you haven't at time of registration. And again, thank you so much. So we are recording this session, and please put your questions in the Q&A. That's better than the chat for questions anyway. And after the presentation, we'll do our best to get to them. So for our talk tonight, well, I think the title of tonight's talk is a strong indicator that we are in for a fun, lively, and of course, informative hour. Lifestyles of the quick and promiscuous, sociosexual behavior of dusky and spinner dolphins. And we're really pleased to have Dr. Tim Markowitz speak to the chapter. He authored in the recently published book, Sex in Cetaceans. And he, of course, did give the title for this talk. So I want to give credit where credit's due. So a little bit about Tim. He received his BA from UC Santa Cruz in Environmental Studies, his Master's of Science from UC Davis in Animal Science, and his PhD from Texas A&M University in Wildlife and Fisheries Sciences. Tim oversees research projects examining humpback whales, bottlenose dolphins, and harbor porpoises in San Francisco Bay and the surrounding waters. His research has led to greater understanding of cetaceans, including harbor porpoise reproductive and foraging behavior, the northward range expansion of coastal bottlenose dolphins, and humpback whale population numbers, movements, and habitat use. And since joining the Marine Mammal Center as Cetacean Field Research Coordinator in 2019, he has expanded his research efforts to include gray whales and new focus on conservation issues for whales, dolphins, and porpoises, including vessel interactions, fisheries bycatch, and climate change. In addition to his role at the Marine Mammal Center, Tim is a popular professor and mentor to graduate students in biology and environmental sciences. He holds part-time positions at UC Berkeley, teaching classes in the departments of integrative biology and environmental science, policy, and management. And it turns out one of Tim's more popular classes is actually human sexuality, as evidenced by its oversubscribed enrollment at Berkeley. So we have a real expert whose expertise crosses species beyond cetaceans. So Tim, thank you so much for being here and sharing all the great work that you're doing, including tonight's talk.
Thank you, Susan. Nice to see everybody on there, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. Really, all the work that you talked about that I've had the great pleasure of doing together with my colleagues at the Marine Mammal Center and here locally in the Bay Area, these are all really team efforts. But what I'm going to talk to you all about today is something a little different. Also a team effort, and this is really research that goes back to well, honestly, well before my PhD. And so Susan mentioned my PhD was at Texas A&M University. She did not mention that my PhD was done at their New Zealand campus. And this is a species here that I work with, the New Zealand Dusky dolphin. And really much of that research was and continuing research continues to be inspired by folks who came before, including my PhD supervisor, Dr. Bernd Wurzig, and his colleagues. And that includes we're going back, quite a number of years before that. So I'm going to sort of take you back in time a little bit to some work in the previous century in this talk titled Lifestyles of the Quick and Promiscuous, the Sociosexual Behavior of Dusky Dolphins. I'm just doing a quick sound check here. Can you hear me okay? Am I coming through okay, Susan?
Very well.
Okay, good. All right. So I have to admit, selfishly, I chose this title because I once chose a very similar title for a book chapter that appeared in a book on dusky dolphins, and the editor removed it. So this is my chance years later to get Lifestyles of the Quick and Promiscuous on the record. And here really we're talking about doing some comparisons of two species of dolphins that live in different parts of the world, and yet have a lot in common, a lot that's very similar between them. And there's really behavioral ecology comparisons between Hawaiian spinner dolphins mostly studied in Kealakekua Bay, Hawaii, and dusky dolphins mostly studied at Kaikoura, New Zealand. Those comparisons are many decades old, the first of them now. As Susan mentioned, yes, I am currently talking to you from the UC Berkeley campus, where I teach in both the Departments of Environmental Science, Policy and Management and in Integrative Biology. I am currently teaching classes in Wildlife Policy and Management, and also in human reproductive biology, of all things. And as you might imagine, my students get some talking to about dolphin behavior and sexual reproduction as well. I also teach biology and marine mammals course on this campus, as well as courses in animal behavior, wildlife ecology, and conservation biology. So, as I mentioned, this is a group effort, and I would be remiss if I did not first and foremost introduce my partner in life and in this research effort, the other Dr. Markowitz in our household. This is my wife, Wendy, and our two kids, a bit younger than they are now. They've grown a bit since this picture was taken. This picture actually was taken by this fellow, Dr. Bernd Wurzig, and he is one of the co-authors on our recently published book chapter and the editor of that book, the Sex and Cetaceans book. And another co-author, Dara Orbach, also helped in that editing effort. And so this is sort of a bit of review that we all worked on together, and goes back many years, includes research by some other folks, including my former research assistant who did her bachelor's honors thesis on the topic of mating behavior in dusky dolphins out of Dartmouth. And we called her, our sort of nickname for her was the dolphin pornographer, because she brought some very high tech, at least at the time, high resolution digital video equipment to help capture some of these mating behaviors and mating chases in real time. Of course, subsequently, Dara did her entire PhD work on that subject and included some new bags of tricks, some new tools, including the use of drones and drone footage. But we also really, to be complete, we have to include going back to the earlier work done with spinner dolphins in Hawaii, much of it led by the late, great Dr. Ken Norris, also who happened to be my favorite professor back in my banana slug days at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Other folks that we need to, include the entire team that helped to collect a lot of those data, and Bernd, who's a co-author collected many of those data on spinner dolphins back in the early days. So without further ado, let's look at these two species and some things that they have in common and some differences between them. The reason for a lot of the early comparisons, and actually, this was really the source of our interest in writing this comparative chapter, is that while they're sort of a world apart and not particularly closely related any more than other dolphins are, they have a lot in common in terms of their socioecology. Both feed at night. They feed on prey associated with the deep scattering layers. They move offshore into deeper water. Neither are particularly deep divers. And so they wait for that deep scattering layer, which migrates vertically on a diel basis, migrates closer to the surface at night. And then these animals dive down a bit to access those prey. There have been some wonderful studies done using acoustic monitoring, looking at this behavior at night by Kelly Bird and others. And most of the research I'm going to talk about is research done with these dolphins during the daytime. This is the time when they come inshore, typically into more shallow water. We can think of this as their free time. This is the time when they rest most heavily. And of course, dolphins, like all cetaceans, have hemispheric sleep. So they don't never sleep completely. They never rest all of their brain, but they do rest most heavily, typically in the middle of the day, opposite their nocturnal feeding. And they also have time for socializing and social sexual play and reproduction. Both live in complex fission fusion societies where they have many different social partners and they display considerable behavioral flexibility. And so they may coordinate and cooperate in different social and ecological contexts. Probably one of the most obvious standout features of these two species is that they are among the most acrobatic of all the dolphin species. They really engage probably in more natural leaping than any other two dolphin species. Of course, the spinner dolphin is named for its sort of famous spins. Dusky dolphins engage in their own forms of acrobatic leaps, including sort of head over tail somersault flips and various twisting and turning, noisy, splashy type leaps. And then we also see, and we'll talk about the role of these sort of clean, high, headfirst re-entry leaps in a mating context for the species. They are both seasonal breeders, as is common for a number of species, and we see seasonal changes in testis mass, seasonal changes in hormones and the sex steroid hormones for both species, and seasonal changes in receptivity. And yet, despite this tendency towards seasonal breeding, we see social sexual behavior occur year-round. So we see sexual interactions between individuals in non-breeding contexts. Let's talk briefly here, a brief background with respect to sexual selection and the evolution of mating systems. Generally speaking, and we talk about this in my human reproductive biology class as well, generally speaking, across the animal kingdom, right? Because of the differential investment in gametes at the level of the gametes, that is, eggs cost more than sperm to produce, we tend to see that we have eager males that will tend to compete for opportunities to mate, and choosy females, that is, females that have various mechanisms by which they can ensure that they breed with males of the highest quality. Of course, in birds, we see even increased female investment in the amniotic egg in birds and in reptiles, but also in birds, we see that that egg being outside the body often requires by parental care for survival of the offspring. And so nest building and provisioning, very often involving two parents, is the difference between life and death for those offspring. And this tends to lead to more monogamous mating systems. That is, we see pair bonds that are maintained over time between males and females. Having said that, it's well documented now with recent genetic studies that even within these monogamous bird societies, we see considerable variation and often extra pair copulations or EPCs. In mammals writ large, we have this sort of doubling and tripling down of maternal investment in the form of gestation and lactation. These are, of course, huge physiological, energetic costs associated with maternity. And this means that maternal investment typically is much greater than paternal investment. On top of this, there's a greater chance for paternity uncertainty. And then that chance actually tends to be the rule in most of your marine mammals, really all your marine mammals. That is, males don't generally have a mechanism for knowing whether or not they're the fathers of the offspring. So typically, males do not invest in parental care, but they do invest heavily in a number of different ways in competing for females. So the basic mating systems, of course, I've been sort of mentioning these in passing, right? Are monogamy, where you have a single male, single female that are pair bonded. Polygyny, a common mating system among mammals, where you have single males mating with multiple females. Polyandry, not so common, where you have a single female that mates with multiple males. We see this, for example, in some of the insect societies of the social insects, such as bees. And we have promiscuity, and promiscuity is where both males and females have multiple partners, but it is at a relatively non-competitive or random context. And then polygynandry, which is a more complex situation involving more competition and choice, where both, again, males and females have multiple partners. So let's take a quick look and compare the reproductive parameters generally for some of the life history traits for Hawaiian spinner and New Zealand dusky dolphins that we're going to be talking about in this talk. Notice they have pretty similar gestation length, just under a year, and a pretty similar time of lactation and dependency on the mother of the calf for nursing of about a year and a half. We also see similar seasonality with respect to calving generally occurring in the spring to fall, and the spinner dolphins in spring to summer in New Zealand dusky dolphins. Of course, these are opposite ends of the year because we're in different hemispheres. So the northern hemisphere, spring and fall, falling at the other end of the year from the southern hemisphere. They both have a similar age of first reproduction of about 7 to 8 years. Similar size at birth, just shy of 1 meter in length. And in both species, we see pretty limited sex size dimorphism. A lot of overlap in sizes between males and females. And now in the case of spinner dolphins, as we'll discuss, this does actually vary a little bit from population to population. So these are data for the Hawaiian spinner dolphin specifically. Here's a look at that variation in mating systems among spinner dolphin populations. That is the species Stenella longirostris. And there's been several publications on this, on the evolution of these different mating systems and how this may actually be linked to some ecological differences across the Pacific. In the eastern tropical Pacific, we see male spinner dolphins with relatively small testis mass, suggesting a limited role for sperm competition. And in this case, in this population, we do see significant sex size dimorphism with some secondary sex characteristics that vary between the species. So there is an enlarged post-anal hump and a forward-canted dorsal fin. Number of these observations, as well as observations in the field, indicate a more polygynous mating system, and we see aggressive male-male contest competition. It is aggressive competition between males for females. This is actually, if you know a bit about dolphin reproductive biology and behavior, this should all sound somewhat familiar to you, because it is the case for bottlenose dolphins that engage in aggressive male-male competition for females, and also have relatively small testis mass. Now, in the case of the Gray's spinner dolphin, there is some variation across this group, but this includes the Hawaiian spinner dolphin, and we see a relatively large testis mass that indicates sperm competition, really lack, as I just showed, of sex size dimorphism, no post-anal hump, no differences in dorsal fin morphology, certainly not any as dramatic as we see in the ETP. And here we have the indication of a polygynandrous system and observations in the wild of multiple partners mating in small groups. And we'll dive into that a little bit more right here. So to make this comparison, we did a lot of reading including of some of my favorite books, maybe some of yours as well. I imagine many of you have these books on your shelves. Going back to some of the classic work with the Hawaiian spinner dolphin. Hawaiian spinner dolphins come ashore to rest during the daytime in shallow bays that are typically less than 50 meters deep. An example of one such bay is Kealakekua, Hawaii. Yes, that is the famous one with the little grass shack and the huma huma nuku nuku apu a'a swimming by. It's not just the huma huma nuku nuku apu a'a, however, and as you can see in this picture, there's Cook's Monument in the background, a couple of spinner dolphins, and you can see some tourists who have rented a kayak paddling by. Coming into these shallow bays to rest does kind of expose these animals to some harassment. And in recent years, the government has really tightened up and trying to reduce a lot of close visitation for these animals during that part of the day when they're resting near shore. Some of this has been supported by work including shore-based work, theodolite tracking work, and this is my friend and colleague Greg Timmel, who did his master's research, as you can see here, using a surveyor's theodolite to track both spinner dolphins and kayakers and other vessels around Kealakekua Bay. So this research and research going back a long way has shown that Hawaiian spinner dolphins tend to be particularly active in the early morning as they come inshore. They're coming inshore from a night of feeding. And as they move inshore, they get closer and closer, tighter to shore, and they slip into more and more heavy rest, typically around midday. Late in the afternoon, they become active again, and we see this moving back and forth the group as it gets more and more active, which has been called zigzag swimming. I have to say, I think the Hawaiian spinner dolphin researchers have like a lot of the best names for dolphin behavior, and this is certainly one, zigzag swimming. And we see this leads into the period of greatest sociosexual activity, typically in the afternoon to evening, as they're kind of beginning to move out of those shallow bays into deeper water. So in terms of the sexual behavior that we see here, we see serial polygynandry, that is multiple males typically mating with a single female in quick succession. A lot of this does occur in just pairs or trios, but particularly during the breeding season, we see another kind of group form. And this leads to another great word, and the word is wuzzle. If you're not familiar with the word wuzzle, you are now, if you weren't familiar before this talk. These are larger bunched interweaving groups, could be a dozen or more individuals, and there's a more space here for competition. The behavior becomes a bit more frantic, and again, this really coincides with the breeding season and that seasonal estrus. I might add, in the case of the spinner dolphin, there were studies done with them in captivity, looking at hormone profiles seasonally. So we've got some really great data on that. In addition to work done from shore and work done from a vessel where you're looking at animals at the surface, there was some ingenious early work done in these relatively clear waters where they used vessels that had underwater viewing platforms in order to collect some wonderful data. Some of you may have heard of these. I think the most famous of which was the semi-submersible seasickness machine. Great data, but apparently not always fun to work from. In the non-breeding season, we see these more casual social sexual interactions still occurring, and still occurring in a diurnal pattern that sort of fits as we're going out offshore in the late afternoon. That seems to be the time we see the greatest social sexual behavior. So moving on to talk a little bit about dusky dolphins. In the case of dusky dolphins around the world, we see that there's some physical size variation between different populations, but really limited sex size dimorphism across the board, and really exceptionally large testis mass for the body size. And that is true across all populations. So we don't have the same variability that I mentioned before with the spinner dolphins, where we have some populations that have more aggressive male-male competition indicated with greater sex size dimorphism, males being significantly larger than females. We don't really see that in dusky dolphins. And here on this table here, you can see I've circled on this is testis mass to body length of the male. And we can see relatively high, circled here, number 27. This is for a number of cetacean taxa. This is from the Dines et al. Paper. There is the dusky dolphin. So here we have, in terms of mating system, and we'll talk about this more. Once was sort of characterized as promiscuous. People thought it must just be all sperm competition. But as I'll present to you here, based on our research, we would call it polygynandry. That there were other forms of competition in addition to sperm competition. My colleague and co-author Dara has called this scramble competition. This is one of those places where she and I beg to differ in terms of the terminology. So scramble competition, classically, as you may know in studies of animal behavior, refers to competition between the males to, how best to say it, get around to as many females as possible. That's, we see something a little bit different than that in dusky dolphin mating chases. And I'll share that with you in a minute. Some more just reproductive biology. Dusky dolphins, females reach sexual maturity age 7 to 8. They have a 2-year reproductive cycle and a mean gestation length of 11.5 months. They're seasonally estrus with calving in the spring and summer. Males reach sexual maturity at a similar age, and during the breeding seasons, the testes get up to 5% of their total body mass. This definitely indicates sperm competition. And again, before much behavior research was done, that combined with the lack of sex size dimorphism led people to say, oh, this is kind of a promiscuous system where it's all about sperm competition and may the best sperm win. Certainly competition is unlikely based on size and strength and aggressive conflicts for this species. As I mentioned earlier, right, both spinner dolphins and dusky dolphins are relatively mid to small bodied dolphins, right? Smaller, for example, than bottlenose dolphins. Both also, as all dolphins do really, have big brains, and I'm just sort of pointing this out to you here. Where the dusky dolphin sits, we just did relative testis mass. Now we're looking at relative brain mass relative to body mass here. And we can see the dusky dolphin here scores quite high. As all my students from my human reproductive biology class learned on day one, of course, the sexiest organ for any social mammal, including human beings, is clearly the brain. So that's a look at the big brain of the dolphin. Mentioned not much difference, really, at least in terms of the mating system between populations of dusky dolphins, although there are significant differences in morphology and in genetics between them. This is where they're found around the world. I work with them primarily here in Kaikoura, and you can see they're in kind of different habitat than the Hawaiian habitat. We're in this deep water canyon immediately offshore with snowy mountains behind. This is a group I photographed off the coast of South Africa. And here's a couple dolphins that I photographed off Argentina. You're gonna have to take my word for it because I faked it. I photoshopped the dolphins in there, so sorry about that. All right. So yes, but that is a guanaco that I also photographed in Argentina. So they occur right around here, actually in a couple of different populations. The Peruvian dolphins are larger bodied with more teeth. But let's focus on New Zealand dusky dolphins. They are gregarious. They hang out in groups ranging from 2 to well over 1,000 during the breeding season in Kaikoura. Those large groups, as we term them, groups of 50 or more, tend to be a bit smaller. They tend to be in the hundreds, maybe 100, 200, 300 dolphins, something like that. They are mobile and wide-ranging with daily movements up to 40 kilometers, and seasonally they move hundreds of kilometers. They're coastal. They inhabit the continental shelf to slope waters. Kaikoura, as I said, is this deep water canyon. The water drops off to more than 1 kilometer deep, but very close to shore. Deep diving sperm whales forage in this area all day long. As I mentioned, dusky dolphins, like spinner dolphins, not deep divers, so they wait until nightfall to feed on prey associated with the deep scattering layer. So this has become a center for fish and birds and marine mammals, a major ecotourism place where we have deep water, lots of upwelling, and this mixing of currents from sort of the tropics and the Antarctic. So dolphins in Kaikoura, as we said, we can see them in large groups, but they often split off these large groups into smaller groups for purposes of mating, for raising calves, mother calf nurseries, and some other all adult groups that sort of wander off to rest together in this area. We will obviously be focusing on the mating activity. And so, goals of our research in studying these animals were to look at the effective breeding season, seasonality on sexual behavior, look at how it varies by time of day, how males compete, whether there's a possibility for cooperation, mechanisms for female choice, and to examine whether we see any sign of aggression, and look at the differences between reproductive and casual sex. So what I'm going to talk to you about here with dusky dolphins, this research really focuses on kind of an 11-year period, although there was, as I said, some follow-on research continued beyond this period. We looked at a bunch of about 300 focal groups of dolphins, collected information on their location and we collected data using data sheets and stopwatches, digital video, digital audio scores of behavior, and high-speed digital SLR photography. We also did some shore-based research using theodolite tracking as well. So, that digital video and photography really allowed us to identify individuals. We could compare them to ID catalogs, and we could combine real-time and post-hoc assessments of individual roles in social and sexual interactions. We looked, for example, during the breeding season, we saw a lot of high-speed chasing. And so we look at which individuals were the chasers and which were the chasees or the chased. And we looked at the position of different individuals prior to and during copulation. We kept track of sex of individuals as best we could whenever we got images of the ventrum, as you can see here, differences between male and female dolphins. So the male dolphin you see here has the genital slit quite a bit further up the ventrum from the anus than the female, and the female also you can see the mammary slits there. So we could use these digital images to sex individuals, and we kept track of sex in real time as well. Of course, during mating interactions, we would also often see male dolphins with the penis extruded, and then that would make it relatively easy to sex those individuals. Here's a look at sexual activity by season. And what we're looking at here, this is some previous work done by Frank Cipriano on this curve here. And the right-hand side, we see seasonal variation in adult male testis mass, so significant variation across the seasons. And we can see that is pretty well linked or tied to the percent of groups in which we see social sexual interactions. But noteworthy here is the fact that we see them year-round, at all times of year in Kaikoura, and we also see them, these sexual interactions occurring in other places that the dolphins may travel to around New Zealand. Observations of neonatal calves indicate conception generally occurs between late spring and late summer. We also see seasonal changes in habitat use in Kaikoura, and really associated with that, we can see these differences in distance to shore and water depth. So here we're looking at water depth. And in summer to fall, the dolphins tend to be found clustered, and we could see that here, in relatively shallow water. They wander less into the deep water, and this makes sense from a reproductive standpoint because that's going to provide more protection from predators, especially for mothers with young calves. And given that the calving occurs seasonally, we're going to see more calves in summer into fall. If we look at how the behavior of the animals vary by time of day, we see, as with spinner dolphins, they rest most heavily in the middle of the day, and they become more active late in the day and as well as early in the day. They also tend to move inshore into shallower depths when resting middle of the day, and they move offshore, particularly late in the day, into deeper water depths. Another thing we see some variability in during the day is when resting, we tend to see closer inter-individual proximity on average than we see as they move offshore. Of course, in a mating context, everybody wants to be close, or at least certainly the males do. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So what about social and sexual activity? So social sexual activity writ large, we see is higher in the morning, drops during the period of heaviest rest, but increases most especially late in the day. And if this sounds familiar, this is the same pattern as was really observed for spinner dolphins in Hawaii. So again, and just to explain what some of these terms are. So contact rubbing is any rubbing one individual against another. Inverted swimming is swimming upside down, which generally both actually Dusky dolphins and spinner dolphins mate belly to belly or ventrum to ventrum with the males on the bottom. And then chasing, and we'll talk about here, mating chases are a sort of predominant feature within these small mating groups during the breeding season. Here we have ventral contact, that is two individuals swimming belly to belly. Sexual approach is a male approaching underneath a female with the penis extruded, and then confirmed intermission. A little bit harder to detect on a reliable basis, but we see an uptick in all of these later in the day. So during the breeding season in particular, we see the formation of mating groups. They average about 6 males and a single female. Studies over the years have varied slightly in terms of observations of the numbers involved, but this is typically what we see. It is usually primarily adults. They're often found near shore, but they can be found in both shallow and deeper water. And the smallest groups are where we see the greatest levels of sexual activity. Larger groups have fewer but longer duration, intermissions, and we see both males and females with multiple partners over short periods of time. Single females more often mate with multiple males, but we did see one case where we had a couple females in a group where a male mated with both. The general pattern within these groups is that on average, about a third of the males successfully copulate with the female, at least during the time when we've been able to collect data on them. There's quite a bit of variability around this, but the point is this is an indication of a form of competition other than sperm competition. And so we can see that in these groups, not all males mate equally. These groups are active, but they're not traveling in a straight ahead direction. They are rather engaged in a lot of interweaving types movements that we might call milling, although maybe that's too calm sounding a word for it. We see much higher rates of social contact behaviors. We just looked at them by time of day, but this is compared to other groups of similar size. Much more social rubbing, inverted swimming, and ventral presentation. And we tend to see periods of very high levels of sexual activity, averaging about 12 minutes. And during these periods, frequent copulations with intercopulatory intervals ranging anywhere from half a minute to 5 or 6 minutes, something like that. Intermission is brief, averaging about 7 seconds during those sort of ventrum to ventrum rubbing sessions. I might add, though, not as brief as the harbor porpoises in San Francisco Bay. So in these groups, we see many more very, very high-speed behaviors, this sort of slicing through the water, which Dusky dolphins do when they're swimming at their highest speed, lateral leaps, that is porpoising. Studies have shown actually porpoising dolphins travel a bit faster, slight bit faster when they're in the air where there's less drag than in the water. And we see a lot of chasing of conspecifics. On average, these chases last for about 20 seconds. And I can't really express to you all enough how fast this is, how variable the movement is. It's pretty challenging, actually, to keep up with all the action. We see a lot more variable heading of the dolphins, sort of everybody out for themselves relative to other groups. And copulation rate actually decreases with increased changes in direction. We'll talk about why in a minute. Big take-home message here, they often don't have much of a swimming formation. Unlike other small groups where you see sort of individuals swimming along in a line. And this probably, again, has to do with the fact that typically in these groups, we have a single female being chased with by multiple males, all jockeying for position. So they are less sort of focused on organizing themselves in a group and each out for their own. So as far as female choice goes, we noted a number of mechanisms for extending chases. The first obvious thing here is that the female is always on top during these mating chases. Every time we could document sex of individuals involved, it was males underneath, females on top. There's got to be some advantage there, because if you're that female, of course, your blowhole is also on top. It's easier to swim along, catch a breath, and keep going. So this would be sort of an example in the behavioral evolution of behavior parlance of a handicap. That is, males are at somewhat of a disadvantage in these chases. And then females also use a number of avoidance strategies, and these were associated with reduced intermission rates. These included rapid changes in direction, re-entry leaps that extended the chase, and that's what we're seeing here. The frequency of re-entry leaps being very, very high, and these kind of head-up braking maneuvers. Basically, the way these work is the males will be chasing the female from below. She'd put her head up in the air, tail down, and they sort of keep swimming on by. She'd turn around and swim in the other direction. So here's a look at re-entry leaps in these mating chases. And re-entry leaps are, again, relatively high leaps where the dolphin gets a breath of air and then plunges back down vertically into the water column. We saw with these that females leap first, followed by the males, and that they occurred at a relatively high clip in mating groups especially. High levels of re-entry leaps were associated with low intermission rates. So re-entry leaps seem to also represent an evasive tactic for prolonging pre-copulatory male-male competition. So on average, during our observations, we saw 2.5 individuals leaping. Now you may say, what the heck does 2.5 mean? How do you get a half leaping dolphin? Well, of course, this is an average number. And when 1 to 2 individuals leaped, that is, the female went up, followed immediately by a single male suitor, the result led quite quickly about half the time to intermission between that male and that female. But when more than 2 individuals engaged in leaping, that is, a female followed by multiple males, the intermission rate following those leaps is about 8%. Following the leaps, we'd see below surface chases that lasted for about 12 seconds on average. The greatest number of intermissions we saw between leaps was about 8. And this was in a very small group of 2 males and a single female, with both males copulating repeatedly. Agonistic behaviors are much less frequent in dusky dolphins, and also I might add in spinner dolphins, than between males than in bottlenose dolphins. But some that we did observe include jostling for position, some very rare open mouth threats, mid-air collisions, and somewhat more common, this rolling over behavior. And that's what it's a little bit hard to see here, but there are 2, there's a male paired with a female here, and a second male is rolling over the top and sort of forcing the 2 apart. And we did see 1 instance of biting. Not a lot of evidence for mate coercion, as you see in bottlenose dolphins, but there's some possibilities there, particularly females with young calves. And it may be that mom calf nurseries may function not only in a sort of anti-predatory context, in a context to kind of raise the young calves in a safer environment with respect to predators, but also to sort of keep them away from marauding males. So this appears to be a case of what I've called mating of the quickest. And again, whether this is scramble competition or something else, sort of an arena, if you will, in which males compete, is a question that's really open to interpretation. But there's no question here that there is pre-copulatory male-male competition in addition to sperm competition, and females appear to use a number of strategies to evade males and prolong the chase. Just going to point this out really quickly here, which is some evidence we have for cooperation between males. That is what we might call teammates to get mates. This is a case of 4 identified males that were observed chasing a lone female together in Kaikoura during the summer breeding season. They were resighted a couple hundred kilometers to the north in winter, in some winter foraging habitat, Admiralty Bay, where they feed during the daytime, feeding together in a foraging group. And they had pretty consistent associations within that group. You can see that cluster there, and also occurred within a relatively narrow range. So they seem to be working together both in terms of chasing a female during the breeding season and chasing fish. This is a cooperative fish feeding during the non-breeding season. So just to wrap up and to kind of wrap up these comparisons a little bit, both these species, engage in seasonal breeding, but both also engage in social and sexual activity year-round. And so we see sexual behavior really occurring for social reasons, as well as for reasons to do with reproduction. And sexual behavior may play a role in communication, in greeting ceremonies, and strengthen bonds in a foraging context. Both these species have this kind of afternoon delight phenomenon, where we see more and more social sexual behavior prior to moving offshore into those deeper waters for feeding. Although female dolphins of both species are seasonally estrus, mating occurs in all seasons in both. And social sexual behavior outside the breeding season is relatively relaxed and non-competitive. In the case of spinner dolphins, we see those wuzzles forming primarily in the breeding season. In the case of dusky dolphins, we see mating groups with a lot of high-speed chasing behavior that form during the breeding season, whereas the sort of social sexual behavior and play that occurs outside the breeding season is much more relaxed. We also see same-sex social sexual interactions, primarily between males, have been observed, and even some cases of social sexual interactions between different species. So, for example, in the case of dusky dolphins, we observe this in more than a quarter of mixed species groupings between dusky and common dolphins. All right, I think I've filled up most of my time here, but for further reading on this and many other great subjects, here is a page turner. This is the new book, Sex and Cetaceans, Morphology, Behavior, and the Evolution of Sexual Strategies. It is a wonderful page turner, and I'm here promoting it on my book tour, but don't worry, I'm not going to make anything. The book is free. It is free online. If you click on this link, you can download yourself a copy and read it. You do have to spend something if you want a hard copy delivered, but it is an open access book, very recent publication, and fascinating. And as you can see, lots of different species of cetaceans, of whales, dolphins, and porpoises, including this menage a trois of gray whales here. All right, I'll leave it there. I don't know, did I save time for questions, Susan?
Yeah, I think so. And Wade does an excellent job of moderating the Q&A, so I'll hand it over to him. I just want to say, I think this has been a great endorsement for this book.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks so much, Tim. This is great, and so much information here. I'll try to organize these questions. We have a couple different ones, and for the folks still on, if anyone wants to drop some more into the Q&A, please feel free. But I guess the first one, kind of logistically, obviously a lot of this is happening in the water and super quickly. How do you kind of analyze all this activity in practice? Like, do you take a lot of film and then slow it down and watch? Like, well, what's kind of the order of operations for that?
Wonderful. Thanks for that question. I didn't really have time to share, so now I get more time to share. And some of this is described in the book chapter, but there have been a number of techniques used over time, and they did kind of evolve. It varies, of course, based on the situation. So what you can do in very sheltered, shallow bays with clear water in Hawaii is going to be a little bit different than what you can do in more open water in New Zealand. But as I mentioned, we have the classic case of underwater viewing platforms, right, from those vessels, those research vessels in Kealakekua Bay. And that was quite a feat of engineering that they used to give a good underwater view of some of these interactions. In Kaikoura, over time, the methods we use evolved. And a lot of this had to do with the advent of new technology. So the move from film cameras to digital cameras, and then the advent of better resolution digital video helped. Some of it was somewhat low tech. One of the things that we used was just a head-mounted mic. So we found that with the video recording, as you might imagine, bouncing around a little boat with very rapid moving dolphins, you had to have a pretty solid stomach, even when you went back and were reviewing the video, because it bounces all over this. You can make yourself really seasick watching it all. But we found that the audio, because we had a running audio sort of monologue of all the behaviors we were seeing, was really, really helpful. So after that, we started head miking and recording on just a dictaphone, which we would then go back and punch in on computer the continuous behavioral data. So it was kind of that, and then combining with high speed, high resolution SLR photography that's time stamped as well. And then moving into the more recent work, which Dara really championed, now we have the advent of drones. So she got some new information on what was going on from that top-down view of the animals, as well as a sort of a view through the water. So that gives us some new information as well.
Awesome, makes sense, and that's really interesting. And then as far as, like, again, kind of drilling more into what these kind of things look like in practice, you mentioned like mate coercion and female avoidance of that, and like what does that actually look like in practice, and what's the like, how do you observe that?
Yeah, thanks for that. So we were looking for this, of course, because one of the best studied systems has been in terms of the reproductive behavior and aggressive male-male competition in bottlenose dolphins. And so we're kind of on the lookout for it. And as I said, we didn't see much, but the sort of most notable exception was a couple instances in which within those mating groups, however it had happened, there was a female with a young calf. And actually in those instances, we did see one case where it appeared that the calf, there was a little bit of calf tossing. I don't think it was an attempt at infanticide. I think it was just like, get the kid out of the way. That was my impression. But certainly the calves seemed to be in distress in those couple of instances. And not to pretend that I can read the mind of a dolphin, because I can't. But it seemed that the chases were particularly frantic. And if I were to interpret that, I would say I had the impression the female just didn't want to be there. And that's not the case for most of those mating chases. So that's, it's really the exception to the rule. And those few instances of any kind of aggressive interaction, again, the exception to the rule. I might add, there's a reason Dusky dolphins have fewer natural markings on their dorsal fins than bottlenose dolphins. Part of the challenge with photo ID for dusky dolphins is only about 1 in 3 on average in these groups have markings we can use. They get most of those markings from each other. And of course, bottlenose dolphins are very aggressive routinely with one another, especially the males.
Interesting. And do you know where, this is another question, do you know where the name Dusky came from, Dusky dolphins? There might be more trivia that we can Google,
I should know. They're all kind of grayish with this sort of the streaks of white. Of course, they're the sister species, sister taxon to our Pacific white-sided dolphin. And I should also know why they're called obscurus. Maybe the two are linked, something in the dusk, in the evening. But I don't. I suspect that Mark Weber, who is on this call, knows the origin of the species name, and it's probably in the book that he's co-editor of. So he could chime in if he wants on the chat and correct me. Embarrassing, because I did my PhD with you and I don't know the origin.
All good. That's more of a trivia question than part of your thesis. I think Mark's joining in real fast. He might have something to say here. I see him coming into the panelist link.
Go ahead, Mark.
Oh, Mark.
Oh,
Mark,
hi, everybody.
Oh, good.
I only did my master's, Tim, so with Dusky dolphins. I don't know or remember the answer to the origin of that name. I'm kind of scrambling through what I have to see if I can figure it out, but sorry, you're on your own there, pal.
All right. Well, the stumper questions, you're always going to get them at the ACS. But here we go.
Good. Our new friend ChatGPT says that it is the origin is because it's Latin for dark or dim, which kind of spun into it. So I have no idea if that's accurate or whatever. But for anyone curious, that's what ChatGPT says. So
I'm pretty sure I know where the spinner dolphin origin comes from. If you've ever seen them spin, it's awesome. It's spectacular.
It is pretty amazing. And then we have another one coming in from, okay, so are there more spinner dolphins in Hawaii than bottlenose dolphins, or more bottlenose? And is there like interactions and differences in behavior between those two in Hawaii specifically?
I believe you're going to see more spinner dolphins in Hawaii. And certainly in these areas where they've been studied, they're the main dolphin species that you see in those bays and places like the Big Island of Hawaii. Yeah.
Cool.
I've still got Mark on the line, though. He can correct me if I get any of this wrong.
Good to have a little backstop there. And as far as I guess kind of adjacent to mating, but as far as what the physiological profile of the dolphins that you study, and dolphins generally when they're sleeping, what does that look like? Like what's the brain activity look like when a dolphin's in kind of a resting mode?
So I could speak with more authority on what it physically looks like in the field. And what it physically looks like in the field is very, very slow swimming. And if you look at them closely, you can sometimes see sort of one eye looks a bit droopy. In the case of some cetaceans that are sort of big-bodied and can just kind of float there at the surface, which is the case for those sperm whales also at Kaikoura, they will just do what we call logging. They'll literally lay still at the surface. But these smaller-bodied dolphins always kind of continue moving along. I will say that for dusky dolphins, we tend to see them rest at the surface a lot. And spinner dolphins tend to kind of mooch up and down through the water column a bit more when they're resting. So that is certainly one difference that you can kind of observe between the two species.
Got it. And you also mentioned at one point the behavior in captivity. Is that a major are both the species that you were talking about kind of victim of captivity in a pretty major way these days?
They've been very rarely kept in captivity, either species. But in particular, If you go back and you look at the spinner dolphin research, there was some really cool sort of reproductive endocrinology that went on with the captive spinner dolphins that can kind of inform our understanding, at least with respect to things like seasonal breeding profiles and the relationship between hormones and behavior for that species. So the tone of the question maybe is leaning toward, oh no, why do we have those dolphins in captivity? And the answer is mostly we don't. And actually, they haven't been very frequently kept in captivity, certainly not as frequently as bottlenose dolphins and killer whales.
Makes sense. And you also, at the beginning, you were talking about the gestation period. I think you mentioned that both were somewhere in kind of the 11-month range. I didn't write it down, but can you comment on kind of how that looks compared to other cetaceans, and is that kind of in line with what other ones are looking like, or is that different from some whales and dolphins, or just kind of general commentary on that?
Yeah, that's pretty similar. What we tend to see is a lot of this does scale with body size. So time at first reproduction and longevity, right, tends to scale with body size. My colleague Mark Weber and Bill Keener, who may also be on the line, published also a chapter in this book on harbor porpoises. Fascinating stuff, the reproductive behavior of harbor porpoises, not only in San Francisco Bay, but around the world. And they start breeding even earlier, at about the age of 4. And their breeding is such that for those females, they're basically spend their entire lives, starting from age 4, either pregnant or nursing or both. And that's kind of like a tight time window for the relatively small body. So again, depending on the size, you're going to have an increase typically in not always gestation length, but especially in the interbirth intervals, as well as that age of first fecundity, the age of reproduction. It's obviously going to be older for a larger body cetaceans, and they live longer on average. So, killer whales and bottlenose dolphins live longer than dusky dolphins and spinner dolphins, which live longer than little porpoises.
Makes sense. And yeah, thank you. I think that's all the Q&A that we had today. Susan, I don't know if anybody texted you on the side or anything on your end, but I think that's it from my side. Thank you so much, Tim.
Oh, you're really, really welcome. It was really fun to have the opportunity to just talk. It's a fun chance to kind of review what we know about these two species. They're really amazing animals, and like us, and you'll see this, lots of this in this book. They have sex for lots of reasons, and only the one is reproduction. There's lots of other reasons that they engage in this sociosexual activity. And that has a lot to do with that big, sexy brain, right? We see, in terms of brain to body mass ratios, it's the creatures with the richest social lives that have the largest brains on Earth. And that includes these species here.
Yeah, it's been really enlightening. The cetacean world is vast, and it was really fun to go into a deep dive about these two species. Makes me want to go to either back to the Big Island or New Zealand soon.
Me too. Fortunately, I'm planning to go to both this year. So,
Fantastic, Tim.
yeah. I'll say hi to the dolphins for you.
Yeah, and maybe you'll have to come back next year for an update.
With more stories. I was just before this talk on with a master's student from Scripps who is traveling next week. I'm a little jealous. She's traveling next week to Kaikoura to do some follow-on research with dusky dolphins. Not about their sexual behavior, about something else, but still, full research.
Okay. Well, hey, thanks again, Tim, and thank you, community, ACS community, and we'll see you in March. We've got a really good talk We're going to go deep into the ocean with Susan Casey. So have a good month, everyone. See you in March.